The winter of 1855 had been unusually harsh. Villages in the southwest of England were cut off by snowdrifts. On the morning of the 8th of February that year, Albert Brailsford prepared to leave his house to begin work. He was the principal of the village school in Topsham, Devon. He glanced outside the window and released an instinctive shiver when he saw snow blanketing the streets outside and buttoned up his coat. When he opened the door, he was struck by a gust of frozen air. He inhaled sharply and pulled up the collar of his coat to better protect himself from the cold and stepped outside. He looked down the road, and his curiosity was immediately aroused by the sight of hoof prints in the snow. They ran all the way down the street. At first glance, he assumed they were the hoof prints of a horse, but he couldn't remember hearing the obvious clip-clop sounds of horses' hooves that morning or last night. He inspected them closer and noticed something strange. They ran in a continuous line, as if one foot was placed deliberately in front of the other. There was no way these were the hoof prints of a horse. Each print was so clear they looked like they had been branded into the frozen snow with red-hot metal. The footprints would extend throughout the county and beyond. The branded footprints could only mean one thing. While everyone was sleeping, the devil had come to the village. It didn't take long for word to spread, and before long the village of Topsham were following the prints south through the snow. The air was alive with the sound of chatter and conjecture. Everyone had a theory, the most popular being that it was an elaborate hoax. But the group froze in disbelief when they saw where the footprints led. The hoof prints led to a 14-foot brick wall and had seemingly abruptly stopped. It seemed impossible for anyone to somehow cast the prints in the snow, only to seemingly disappear into a solid brick wall. The group looked about, dumbfounded, searching for a second set of tracks that could somehow explain what they were seeing. When all of a sudden, they heard a voice shouting from the other side of the wall. They walked around and saw the footprints had continued on the other side of the wall. It was as if the owner had simply sprung over the wall and continued walking, completely unimpeded by the obstacle. Any talk of the hoof prints being faked was quickly dismissed, and the mood slowly changed from one of intrigue to one of growing fear. They followed the tracks to a haystack, and the hoof prints continued on the other side, without touching the snow on top. The prints continued in a fashion that made no logical sense. They continued under gooseberry bushes and over the tops of houses. It was as if whatever this creature was could shapeshift at will, while being able to leap impossible heights with ease. The anxious investigators followed the tracks mile after mile across the Devon countryside, hoping to find an answer to the seemingly impossible phenomena that had occurred overnight. The hoof prints went through Limpstone. There was not a garden where footprints were not observed. The tracks appeared to be more of a biped than a quadruped, and then continued through Exmouth, Teignmouth, Dawlish and Totnes, and almost to Plymouth. It had also jumped over the 2-mile estuary of the River Exe. This was a distance of over 40 miles, or just over 64 kilometres. But as the footprints meandered and wandered extensively within that area, it could easily have covered up to 100 miles, or just over 160 kilometres. They showed more sinister intent when they were seen to approach the doors of houses, only to turn away, as if the creature had changed its mind for some reason. Their worst fears were confirmed when the hoof prints split in the middle and began to take on the characteristics of a cloven hoof. It appeared beyond doubt the nature of the creature, and that it had shapeshifted into its true form. Panic spread throughout the community like wildfire. It was decided that something had to be done to protect themselves from the devil's return. In Dawlish, men with hunting dogs tracked the prints to a local woods. The dogs ran enthusiastically ahead, but moments later they returned, whining, baying, and clearly terrified. The men, now worried for the well-being of their animals, and growing ever more fearful of what could make a pack of hunting dogs cower and run away in terror, called off the hunt. In other villages, men armed with pitchforks and guns followed the trail, determined to confront the creature. They followed the tracks all through the day, and when night fell and it was too dark to continue, people locked their doors and slept with weapons nearby, in nervous anticipation of what the night would bring. But the footprints never returned. This wasn't the first time devil's footprints had been reported in England. In the 1840s, there were reports of footprints in the parish of Rowley Regis, the West Midlands. But rather than resembling hooves, they were described as looking like a huge misshapen human foot. Any vegetation that had been trodden on by the prints was destroyed, and the turf looked like it had been scorched. The ground scorched by the footprints would remain barren for years to come. Although the footprints did not return to Devon, they would reappear in America almost 60 years later. Following a heavy snowfall in 1909, there were reports of thousands of devil's footprints all across the state of New Jersey. Like with the tracks in Devon, they covered huge distances, easily leapt over obstacles like walls, buildings, and fences before abruptly stopping. The devil's footprints were reported all over the state, but they first appeared in the Pine Barrens, the home of none other than the infamous Jersey Devil. But that cryptid will be covered in another episode. So how do we explain the mystery of the devil's footprints? Had the devil truly visited the county of Devon, walking up to the houses of sleeping, unsuspecting people as he walked the countryside in search of souls to take? Or is there another explanation? Some of the most popular theories were that these were the misidentified tracks of an animal. These range from kangaroos, badgers, otters, rats and birds. The problem with this theory is no one animal can account for a combination of the shape of the print, the distance travelled, and how it was able to leap over walls and onto the roofs of houses. The tracks on the roofs of houses would rule out badgers, otters and rats. The shape of the tracks would rule out an escaped kangaroo, and the distance of the tracks rule out a bird. It's difficult to conceive a bird hopping 40 miles rather than flying. Another theory that gained traction was that it was an experimental air balloon that broke free of its moorings and trailed 2 shackles at the end of ropes. While this could explain how the tracks travelled so long and how the tracks were seen on roofs, it doesn't explain the circular motion of the footprints, and it doesn't explain how the footprints went up to doors or houses and then turned back again. The nature of the tracks ruled them out being done by a human prankster. It would have been hard enough for a person to get the tracks on the roofs of the buildings, let alone to somehow leap over walls and stacks of hay. But the distance of the tracks make it nearly impossible for them to have been done by a person. The tracks were 40 miles long, or just over 64 kilometres. To put that in perspective, it would take an experienced hiker over 11 hours to walk 40 miles without stopping when in good conditions. This would take significantly longer in snow. There is no way a person could have travelled this distance overnight. And when taken into consideration the meandering route, it would likely have taken a person at least twice this long. Unfortunately, the newspapers didn't report the incident until a week after it occurred. So the likelihood is that vital clues would have been lost by the time more people had a chance to investigate. So if it wasn't an animal, person or air balloon, could it be something more sinister? If this was a trick, then perhaps there is no better candidate than the devil himself, the original trickster of mankind. For now though, whatever was behind the devil's footprints is likely to remain unexplained. If you enjoyed this episode, and if you've made it this far, thank you very much for listening.